phone. So my handle is my name is DJ.
I think follow. I don't.
And on here.
Super. I've got a few questions from
Yes.
last time.
Yes.
I could roll out.
Right. Okay, great.
How was your journey?
It was good.
Purpose of plastic. I bring a paper cup in there. I know. There are so many, ridiculous regulations, I guess.
Okay.
Integral and then shuttle.
Yeah. Shuttle's quite a trick.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I mean, I was actually quite cross. Surely there is an easier way to get to conclusion. It was exactly that.
I know. I don't know exactly why. I don't know. I don't see the risk. People are masked, have masks. All the windows, and then you can do it. Yeah. Did you get here yesterday, Kamba?
I arrived yesterday, yourself?
Yes.
You're from London?
Yes, from London. We flew from
Which flight did you go on?
10:30 or 10:35, I think. Heathrow
you
to
went
Rome.
to Rome.
Yeah.
I went to Stansted.
Yeah, I think that's the best choice. But living in Oxford is a bit more difficult to get to Stansted. So
Yes. I had to leave 4 in the morning.
oh gosh.
Going, or we ask, or we sign. Do we get going, or do we ask? Will they tell us? I don't know whether there's some people sort of mulling around. Anytime he's on. Do you have it? Hello, hello. What? Afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll get going. I haven't seen a sign. I hope you can all hear us. Welcome to the panel this afternoon looking at the links between editorial independence and financial sustainability. It's really great to see you all in person. It's great to see everyone remembering how to interact socially, to get fully dressed, and come to this rather wonderful room. Firstly, before we get going, I want to say a big thanks to the festival organisers. It must have taken quite a leap of faith to give this event the green light a few months ago, and it's really great to be back to see everyone, so a big thanks to them. My name is Will Church. I'm the Director of the Media Freedom Programme at Thomson Reuters Foundation. The foundation is the corporate charity of Thomson Reuters, the global news and information company. And we have three main focus areas. We foster inclusive economies, we promote human rights, and we advance media freedom. And that's why I'm here. As an organization, a quick word on our approach is we've been working in this space for over 35 years. And we bring to the table a kind of unique blend of journalism, media development, and legal expertise, all with the aim of helping to foster a free and more prosperous media ecosystem. And that's why this conversation today fits in with our remit. We've been having these conversations for a number of years. About 2 years ago, we thought this issue might be peaking, foolishly, and we were having lots of conversations then. But it's certainly one of the defining issues in the media ecosystem space at the moment, and has been for a long time. I started at the foundation 10 years ago, in 2010, when we thought that being a journalist and running a newsroom was hard at that point. In that time, obviously, in 2010, actually, coincidentally, that was the year that the Times in London introduced the first general news paywall. It was a few years after the introduction of the iPhone. So in the
story should be given equal time or equal space. You know, the percentage is still high, but it's not so high. And also, if you ask people if the news media should be neutral on every issue, including climate change, including, you know, domestic violence, things like that, the percentage is a bit smaller. Still a majority, but a bit smaller. And also these percentages are usually lower for younger people, for example, for more partisan people, both on the left and the right. So there's some nuance into that, but most people say that they want impartial news. Does it mean that they only consume impartial news? Actually not. You know, the only thing that means is that they want news and opinion actually separated. They know where the opinionated takes are, and they go for them, usually on social media, on opinionated outlets, but they want impartial news. That's definitely it. And the second point that I would make on your question is that actually, you know, many people outside of this room have a very cynic view of journalism, and we should be aware of that. You know, this data point comes from the Trust in News project, a project that we do on Brazil and India and the UK and the US, and 43%, so almost half of the population in Brazil, think that journalists manipulate their stories on purpose to influence people. Just think about that, you know. Almost half of the people in Brazil actually think that we manipulate, you know, the news stories on purpose for political reasons, for commercial reasons. So again, we should be aware, you know, that many people are disenchanted with journalism, that many people don't trust the news. They tend to be older people, they tend to be less educated people, mostly living in rural areas, especially in some countries. And that's something that we should all, you know, think about, because sometimes in Perugia we think that we talk about journalism as an ideal, but, you know, these flaws are real, and people actually are seeing them.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I mean, it's very reassuring that there's such a high, the first percentage you gave of people want independent media. Just to build on that, we did some research within one of our programs, actually in Ukraine, last year or 2 years ago, to a big audience analysis, and generally, I think 65% said we want and we consume, we use only independent media. We had a deep dive into that, what that media was, and it turns out often it wasn't independent media, or I mean, maybe there's a wider question around clarification of what independent media is, but in general, they were looking at agenda-driven work, a lot of celebrity bloggers, that sort of thing, because celebrities are independent. So, what is there any research around that? Like, what people do people know when they're consuming independent media?
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. I mean, we haven't done research on Ukraine in particular, but that's something that we also see in other countries. And you know, on the digital news report, when we ask about impartiality, we also notice when talking to people, not on the survey, but on the focus groups and in-depth conversations with people, that they definitely use other kinds of media that are not impartial. They want to have impartial news. They want to have a place where they can see the facts, but they also use, things like influencers on social media, like opinionated outlets. They really, sometimes they watch TV and they are really happy to see commentators, even if they are sometimes very radical on issues. They are happy to use all that, but they still want to have a place, where they can see exactly what's going on and see the facts. And obviously, there are limitations to this, and there are countries where impartiality is very difficult. I mean, if you are in the middle of a war, as Ukrainians are right now, obviously impartiality means very different things in there, maybe. But people still care about impartial news, even if they consume things that are not so impartial.
Right, so a good start, but work to be done, basically. Thanks, Eduardo. So, Kambar, if I can come to you. So, we're seeing increasingly media freedom as an issue in the news. It's much more of a high-profile thing now. Great, thankfully. I wonder if that's partly because we're seeing an increase in focus on this from democratic governments. We're seeing, obviously there are certain initiatives going on right now, but why are we seeing this change? Why are governments now seeing this as a more critical issue?
Well, thank you very much, Bill, for inviting me to this panel, and also a big thank you to the festival organisers. It's great to be here. And on a personal note, as someone who's been working on media freedom just before the pandemic, I've not really had a chance to spend as much time with journalists as I would like, apart from obviously many of the Zoom calls that we've been on. So for me, personally, this is a really great opportunity to meet everyone who is involved in the media landscape, but also to say thank you as well, because we've heard a lot about the challenges of media freedom, but not enough thanks given to all those who are working so hard on this issue and some of the challenges they face. So it's great to be here. Insofar as the point you make about this increased focus on media freedom by governments, I will give you a perspective from the British government, and I'm very keen to hear your reflections as well. As an aside, I note that there says no question from the audience, that the ex-lawyer in me wonders whether we can get away by not necessarily questions from the audience, maybe comments from the audience. I'll leave that to the organisers to reflect on, because I'm very much here to listen as well and listen to all your views. I would say, yes, there's definitely been an increase at the highest political levels on media freedom over the last 3 or 4 years by governments, especially those governments in the West. And I would say that, wouldn't I, because I represent a government in the West. But I think if you go take a step back and look at the problem that we face, and forgive me if I'm telling you stuff that already know, but there's been a gradual realization over the last couple of years that media freedom is significantly under attack in all sorts of ways. I'll just read a number of sort of helpful facts, so you don't just take the words of a diplomat for granted here. We've got UNESCO, who have said over the last 5 years, 85% of the world's population have experienced a decline in press freedom. Journalists are increasingly under attack globally, according to a whole host of different media freedom metric results. We've got repressive media laws increasing globally. Over the last 5 years, at least 44 countries have amended, adapted their laws to make them more repressive. You've got declining revenues. Over the last 5 years, global newspaper advertising revenues have dropped by half. And then you've got, on top of that, the problems around digital repression and internet shutdowns, a key means for media freedom to be operational. There have been over 155 internet shutdowns over the last 2 years in over 29 countries. So overall, there is a massive threat and attack on media freedom. And as a result of that, many governments are coming together and really picking up the point you made, Bill, that media freedom, this industry, is a cornerstone to democracy. It's often the canary in the coal mine when it comes to telling us the health of a democracy. Because we all know that in different contexts, it's the media, it's the journalists who are often the first to be attacked, because they're able to call out problems, they're able to hold power to account. Once you take them out, you're able to increase your control. So as a result of that, countries have put this issue at a much more higher political level. A few examples, if I may. We've had the Media Freedom Coalition, which was established by the UK and Canada in 2019. And over the last 2 or 3 years, it's grown over 51 countries strong. It's issued over 21 statements, and it's now trying to support journalists through the UNESCO Global Media Defence Fund. At least 1,700 have been supported. It's also trying to create energized diplomatic networks in countries of concern whereby people can come together and give a platform, often where those countries don't allow a platform to be given to media freedom. We've also seen through the UK G7 presidency very strong language on media freedom, and in particular, the importance and the interrelationship between independent media voices and issues around development. And I want to come on to that briefly in a second. And I'm also pleased to say that some of our partners have taken those messages to heart, and we saw media freedom as a key part of the US Summit for Democracy. And there's going to be a second Summit for Democracy, I understand, later this year or early next year. So overall, the political focus is really increasing because we recognize that if the current trend continues, democracies overall are going to be much more fragile, and democracies overall are under attack because, as of last year, people have said, depending on different metrics, that autocracies, for the first time in history, have a greater share of global GDP than democracies. So from our perspective, media freedom is intrinsic to our overall struggle around trying to promote what we believe to be a democratic order, but a global one which reflects global norms, not just those in the West. So those are a few reflections from me. And my final thought on the development point, if I may. If you spoke to me 3 or 4 years ago as a representative of the UK on these issues, you probably have 2 people here. One would be a development practitioner talking to you about how development can support media freedom. And truth be told, I think the development sector has often seen media freedom as a bit of a niche issue, hasn't really focused on it. And then you would have had a representative from the Foreign Service who would be talking to you the complexities around issues of media sustainability. Sorry for using that word, but it's important. What we have seen through our own journey in the UK, this is the merger of our development and our Foreign Service together, is that how complicated this problem is, how we need to take a comprehensive approach to issues around media freedom. So as a result of that, we are trying to encourage our development partners globally to look at media freedom as critical to their overall development agenda. And there's some interesting work that I can talk about later on in terms of potentially what more we can be doing in this space. Thank you.
Thank you, Untitled. Some very interesting reflections there. And it's very interesting. I want to come to Khadija, if I can, talking about some of the impacts then, that this tension between financial survivability and editorial independence, what the impacts are. Kamba obviously referred to, democratic governments are having to step in here because there's basically more governments who are stepping the other way and making life harder. I'd be interested in some, I don't know, examples of some of that pressure and what you're seeing, I don't know, state capture.
So yeah, so I think that, we've spoken a little, I've mentioned already Hungary. I was on a press freedom mission to Hungary just a few weeks ago. And, even though I've read several reports, I've spoken to colleagues from Hungary about the situation, they're actually coming up front and confronting it physically, shocked me. Because it's almost impossible to do independent journalism in that country. The entire atmosphere for independent journalism has been eroded. That's not to say that there aren't glimmers of hope, and I think that, some of our colleagues are here and they're fiercely independent and especially brave and courageous. But the entire system, and that's the thing, right? It's one or two examples does not equate an entire system, and it's an entire system that has been eroded. And that becomes a very easy, replicable system to take across. And one of the scariest sights that I saw in Hungary when I was there was, one of the bridges over the river being decked out in Brazilian flags, and it was because President Bolsonaro was visiting. And it frightened me that, the same kind of system that might, that is in place in Hungary could easily be exportable. And already there are huge issues in Brazil under President Bolsonaro. The economics of media and the current broken business model does not make it easier. And then on top of that, we have increasingly governments like Brazil, like India, that are democracies on paper, but are illiberal and are particularly attacking the news media, attacking individual journalists, individual institutions, and shutting them down one way or the other. So there is a huge problem in other contexts. In Latin America, there's, government advertising gets used, is weaponized in certain ways. In Kenya, closer to where I'm from, it's a similar phenomenon where it's, government advertising or, the big corporates that are, their advertising go to the big players. And so that, and the big players are, allied to one or other politician, even though they may be independent on, on paper. So new entrants really don't have any competitive edge. They're not able to really make it through traditional means. So there's, there's a system change. What I'm trying to say is that there isn't, ensuring this, the survival of one institution is not enough. What we need to really think about is how we ensure the survival of a system. So I've said that I don't like the word sustainability, and it's mostly because of my experience as a newsroom leader who's had to fill out many, many forms for grant funding that ask me, how will your institution be sustainable in 2, 3, 4 years, right? And I don't have a bloody answer to that. But I think that instead of thinking about sustainability, what I'd rather like us to think about is resilience, because that's what we can work towards. No one has an answer to sustainability right now, right? But I think that there are strategies for resilience. There are examples of resilience, whether they are in the individual, some of whom are here, who are exceptional in what they do, or the institutions that are doing fantastic work despite outrageous pressures on them. So what we really, really have to do is think about how do we change the systems. And that will take the cooperation of governments in the West as well as governments elsewhere. It will take a global consensus to move forward. But really, I think, well, what we have to do is just take a step back and think about what the value of journalism is. And think about why do we need this to continue. It is a public good We can't survive as humanity without understanding what is happening around us. And at its basic form, that's what journalism does. It helps us understand the world that we're living in. And without it, we can't survive. And that's why journalism has to endure. That's why an independent journalism is integral to our survival as a human species. That's why it will take a global consensus. It will take us to come together as humanity and say, this thing has to survive. Please let us find a way to get us through.
Thank you, Khadija. I will come back to that point, mostly around like, how do we do that. But if I can actually stay with you for a moment, based on your experience working in newsrooms, I wonder also, before we move on to the solutions, what are some of the other impacts of this tension between resilience and editorial independence, like in the newsroom? Does it impact decisions? Are there trade-offs?
I would imagine that in many newsrooms there are trade-offs to be made. If anything, I think that if we think about the number of stories that a newsroom can get to, right, because of declining resources, that ultimately impacts on the quality of the product out there. So that's one way where there's a real impact, right? Even the best intentioned newsrooms that are safeguarding their independence are impacted in that way. And I've seen this in South Africa. I've seen it as a newsroom leader where, yes, there's a vast swath of rural South Africa that was without water. And I needed to send a reporter out there to find out what's happening. And I look across the newsroom and who do I send, right? There's no one there. And the thing that frightened me was, okay, I was leading the Mail and Guardian at that time, which is a rather small independent news publication. But then when I got together with other editors, some of them with much better resources, and all of them spoke about the same thing, which told me that cumulatively we were not able to tell the complex picture of South Africa. And that's the thing, that as humanity we are complex, and as a place in South Africa we are complex, as a people we are complex, and we need to be able to flesh out that complexity. And when we fail to flesh out that complexity, when we provide simplistic narratives, we feed populism. And that's what's happening. So, that's one direct impact. But then I think that in many other newsrooms, there is a very, a more simple trade-off that is being made in many newsrooms, where do we tell the story about this organization or this company when actually they have an advertising deal with us? Does that go forward? Because it does mean the difference between getting paid next month or not. And that's a very real decision. When I was in Hungary, a journalist there asked me, what would your advice be for someone working at the Hungarian public broadcaster when they are told to cover a story in a certain way? And I said to them that it's easy for me to say, you walk out of that newsroom right away, you resign in principle, because of course, yes, it's wrong, right? And all of us sitting here, but then it's also, it's haughty of me to think that that's possible when I don't have any clue about how that person is going to pay their rent or their kids' school fees next month. But rather, I think this is why we have to take a step back and think about how do we ensure that the systems of control are challenged to ensure that that journalist never has to be in that position. How do we ensure that? So I think that what I want to prompt us to think about is not just individual acts of action, right, while those are important, but rather prompt us towards systems change.
Yeah. And it's a very interesting point. Like, there's so many examples of people, journalists we know, who have been trained in best practice, and they end up working for, let's call it disreputable media, or state media somewhere, because they would tell you they need to pay their bills and pay their mortgage and that sort of thing. Fascinating. If I can move on, I mentioned in the intro also talking about we're having this conversation now in the context of COVID. It's not post-COVID. We're in COVID still. And I wonder how has this exacerbated the problem, Eduardo? What is the research telling us?
Yeah, it's been really, really tough for many news organizations out there. There's been some great shoots in, and places and news organizations that are doing well, mostly, in rich countries, mostly national newspapers, big news brands. But for many, it's been very tough. Our colleagues, Rasmus Nielsen and Federica, did this report that we published in November 2020. And the title is very clear. It's, few winners and many losers. And that's more or less what we see. I mean, we surveyed 165 news organizations from, many, many, many places. And only 14% or so said that they had, either more revenue than before the pandemic or stable revenue. And most of the people that we surveyed and most of the news publishers are actually making much, much less money right now than the money that they made in 2019. So the situation is really difficult. What I think is really, really frustrating from the point of view of the journalists, from our point of view, is that much of the public actually don't know about this, believe it or not. We surveyed people around these issues for the Digital News Report, and only 30% of the people we surveyed think that actually news publishers are making less money than 10 years ago. Something that is clearly not true. I mean, most news organizations now are making much, much less money, than 10 years ago, but people don't know. People don't realize. Sometimes news organizations, publish these kind of news stories like praising themselves and saying how many, millions of followers they have or millions of page views. And some people are confused about this. Most people don't really know how difficult the situation it is for news organizations. We should say this more often as journalists. The other thing that is quite frustrating, but on the other hand is really understandable, is that most people don't want the government to step in. Most people don't want, the government actually helping the media. For obvious reasons, and Khadija has been very clear on this. When she spoke about South Africa and about Hungary. I come from Spain, and in Spain, most public governments, regional governments, and also governments under the cities are weaponizing public advertising and giving it with no transparency to news organizations that publish when they want to hear. So, I'm very, very wary about, the government actually helping the media. But having said all that, I think the pandemic has also has had a very, very good side and good lessons for us as journalists. I mean, we've seen trust in news going up, actually, in the last year, probably because the news has been, more evidence-based, more focused on science, a bit less focused on polarization and politics. And I think that's a big lesson, and hopefully, we learn that lesson going forward, and, we try to report on things a bit more, evidence-based, as we've done with COVID. And also, what I think is also clear is that the news media have helped people going through this, in terms of knowing about vaccines, in terms of knowing, about the disease itself. Our research shows that, that people who actually get their news on COVID from news organizations are better informed. And again, we do many things wrong in the news media, but we should be aware that we've done really well on that.
That's a very good point, because all that good news, though, somehow in my mind, I'm thinking of that stat that basically 70% of people assume that news media is making more money than it's ever made before. And that ties in with Khadija, how are we going to mobilize society to realize this is a real problem, a real issue? I want to, we've got 20 minutes, I think, to solve this problem between us. So obviously revenue is a big thing. 14% of, you said, Eduardo, 14% of people, of organizations are expecting to make less, a profit. Coming back to you, Khadija, sorry to keep coming back to you. You're involved in a very interesting project that's looking to get funds to news organizations. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
So thanks. This is the part where I get to, it's the editorial part. So the organization I'm currently working for is called the International Fund for Public Interest Media. And it's been born out of the realization of this crisis. And as bad as it is in places like Europe, it's even worse in low and middle income countries. And so I have that experience both as a digital journalist and then as a newsroom leader about the absolute lack of opportunity to ensure the resilience of institutions in the current economic climate. So the International Fund for Public Interest Media is born out of the realization of this crisis, the realization that many organizations will be shut down, many journalists will be laid off until we find a solution. We hope that we are going to come together as society at some point, hopefully within the next 10 years, and find that solution. But in the meanwhile, we're seeing news deserts being created. We're seeing vast areas of the world that are going unreported. We're seeing people not being able to understand what's happening. When I spoke to somebody in Colombia recently, well, it wasn't recently, it was sometime last year, he put it to me like this. He said, there's a region in rural Colombia, he said, where I'm pretty sure a 20-something-year-old there knows that Britney Spears has an issue with her father, but has no idea who the mayor of their town is, right? And that's kind of the crisis that we're facing. It has many names. So the fund is trying to ensure that news media survives in the current moment. It's not about putting good money into bad decisions, not at all. But it's about supporting the resilience of news media institutions. It's about ensuring it is a financial instrument, so it is funding for news organizations to negotiate this current period. But on top of that, what we're hoping to do is also ensure a transfer of knowledge. Because I'm not sure about all of you, but where I come from in South Africa, the examples that kept being quoted to me, for example, as successes were The Guardian in the UK or the New York Times in the US. And I love The Guardian and I love the New York Times, but I'm never going to be able to replicate their models in South Africa. And so too, my colleagues in Malawi not going to be able to do that. And on top of that, I think that there are huge question marks whether reader revenue models in general can be applicable to particularly low-income countries. So how do we ensure that examples of what is working in contexts similar to us, and that knowledge and those strategies are shared across those nations and those grantees? And so the fund wants to ensure that there is a transfer as much of financial capital as knowledge capital. So it is ambitious. We're hoping to launch actually in a few weeks on World Press Freedom Day. So keep an eye out on all of our channels. We're going to be launching an open call. We're starting off with just a handful of countries and then hopefully building up. But really this is for us, and the reason that I have left the newsroom. I love journalism, and I love being a journalist, and I think it's the best job in the world. But I can understand as well that if things go the way they are, that journalism is going to become a profession where only a few elite people may enter. It's going to become inaccessible to most people. And for me, it's really important that young women, particularly, women from backgrounds like mine, can wake up and say they want to be a journalist, and they're not going to be scoffed at, but rather they're going to be supported, and they're going to be able to be, their journey is going to be facilitated. And that's why I've joined this initiative, because I think that there is a real threat to journalism as we know it dying. So this organization appeals, as you can tell, to my most idealistic self. But it really is, for me, it is an opportunity, the first, I think, opportunity for us to come together as humanity to ensure that there is at least some funding available to where it's needed most.
That's a real call to arms. And we're all very excited to see how that goes. And yeah, I hope you keep everyone informed. Well, we'll be watching as you launch. But as you kind of alluded, that's one solution. That's an immediate, not a stopgap, but it's with the knowledge. It's partly a stopgap, and then hopefully the knowledge transfer will help build. But what other, Kemba, if I come to you, I wonder what other steps are possible here in this solutions world. What can government do?
Thank you. It's a bit difficult to follow, Khadija, after that very powerful and impassioned appeal there, which I agree with completely. Just a couple of words of caution before you sort of hear from me. Firstly, I'm always cautious about a sort of a government-centric view when it comes to solutions. As we all know, this is a very complicated problem, and I'm always skeptical when people first think that governments are going to be the answer. We may be part of the solution, but we're certainly not going to be the only means to answer this problem. And to some extent, there's a danger that if governments become too involved, then we risk undermining the essence that we're talking about, namely independent voices. So a word of caution there. Also a word of caution in the sense that I come from a country which also has issues. So I don't profess to sort of speak here before you and tell you that we come from some sort of media freedom nirvana and that all the answers are in the UK. Far from it. We also have some issues, and we are learning as everyone else is. And finally, we just have to be conscious that, unfortunately, we are living in a very difficult physical climate. If I was speaking to you about a month ago, I would be telling you that we are living in a climate which has been affected by the pandemic. And illustration of that, the UK's spending on development has gone down. Now, unfortunately, because of the tragic issues in Ukraine, we're also facing a cost of living crisis in the UK and globally, which is putting huge pressures on the public purse. So in that regard, we have to be conscious that when it comes to solutions, this is not an environment whereby, as much as I want to, I could tell you the UK is going to be committing X amount to solve the problem. It's very, very difficult. So what can we do? Well, there are some positives out there we should latch on to. I think there's some interesting studies, certainly in the UK, which has shown that every percentage point spent on media freedom leads to, I think, a 0.37% increase in voter turnout at the democratic local level. That's important. I think as advocates of media freedom collectively as a community, we need to be making the case through evidence and data, picking on some of the points Eduardo has made here, that those types of evidence help policymakers, help decision makers, ensure that the finite resources available, the difficult decisions made, can lead to tangible results. Similarly, I think it's really important for us to be asking ourselves collectively, how does media freedom support some of the more global challenges of our times? So to what extent can media freedom and independent voices, how can they support issues around checking disinformation, misinformation? How can they help us deal with the challenges of fuel poverty globally? How can they help us deal with the challenges around food insecurity? I'm sure their data is there. And this comes back to a point I was making earlier, that sometimes in the development sector, media freedom has been a bit of a niche issue. The more we can collectively make those linkages, bring facts, data to bear, the more likely it is that when those decisions are made, either political decisions or decisions about resource allocation, media freedom will be part of that process, whereas in the past, it may have not even been in the room, really. So I think there is an onus on all of us as a community who believe in this to be thinking a bit more laterally about how we make those linkages. Insofar as what we have been doing in the UK, I'll just maybe highlight two particular points. One is we have got a primed program. Some of you are aware of that, involved in that. It's a collaborative program that brings together many sector leaders, including BBC Media Action, Free Press Unlimited, International Media Support, Media Development Investment Fund. And a major focus there is to look at generating learning and disseminating that learning to ensure that as many people as possible are able to look at what works and then ask, can that lesson work in my context? How can it be adapted? We also have recently started a process whereby we are trying to encourage the development sector to update some of the principles it has when it comes to looking at issues around financing, to ensure that media freedom is part of that agenda. So we started as part of the Media Freedom Coalition. There's a sub-working group that the UK is co-chairing to look at issues around how can we increase cooperation in the development sector to support this. That builds on some of the very interesting conclusions off the back of the G7 UK presidency. But by no means are they going to be the answer. So I'm looking to get some more thoughts from yourselves in the margins of this festival, and hopefully together we can be coming up with a number of, I hope, innovative but also impactful solutions as well. Thank you.
Super, thank you, Kemba. And that's given a great background to what's needed in the sort of, we call it the enabling environment around the media sector. Eduardo, more directly, can media pay for itself? And thanks for the question from @Gathara, who's alluded to this. Can public interest media be sustainable? Sorry, resilient to.
Well, I mean, the good news, and let's start with the news. With the good news is that we've seen examples of this. We've seen examples of this, and not just in the UK or the US, as Khadija mentioned, but all around the world. We have examples of digital independent news organizations that are not just sustainable, but actually making money. In Spain, we have the example of El Diario, for example, the example of El Confidencial, both digital-born news organizations, really valuable and really impactful, publishing investigations, doing great stuff. But also in the Global South, I mean, in Colombia, La Silla Vacía, for example, great news organization, digital-born news organization, several revenue streams, really, really successful. Efecto Cucuyo in Venezuela. Venezuela is one of the worst countries to be a journalist right now. And they are, actually doing great journalism digitally. And I think the key lesson here is that digital is really great for this because it requires less money. It used to be really expensive to create a newspaper in the print times. Now it's really cheap, and many news organizations are making the most of this and are succeeding. The other good news about digital is that this news organization can spend more money on actual journalism. You don't have the industrial processes. You don't have to pay for the printing presses, things like that. So both things are really important, and I think a few news organizations are making the most of this around the world. Obviously, the situation is not easy, especially with reader revenue models that Khadija mentioned before. We have to be aware that only a small proportion of people is willing to pay for news right now online. We've done this question on the Digital News Report for 10 years now. It's always like that in most countries. Of course, the Nordic countries are much better on this. The US is much better on this. But even in countries like the UK or Spain, it's like around 10% of people who really say that they are willing to pay or are paying for news online. So, we have to be aware of this. On the other hand, you don't need everyone to pay for your product. You just need, a small minority of the people who read your news organization to actually pay for it. And in terms of mission, there are open models. They are membership models like the one The Guardian has or El Diario has in Spain. And that's fine, mission-wise. I mean, people can still read your stuff. There's no hard paywall. And we are seeing those kind of models succeeding in different places. Obviously, in low-income countries, it's much more difficult to convince people to pay. But even in those countries, we are seeing examples of news organizations, for example, making the most of their diasporas. And, people who live in exile or in, abroad actually paying for the product or supporting the product. And we are seeing that right now with Ukraine, and the big campaign that they have launched, to support Ukrainian media. I think this is definitely valuable. Just a final point on government help. I think definitely what the UK is doing on this and other governments is really useful. But in many countries, and we said that before, in Hungary and in Venezuela, in Mexico, we are seeing this. People are really wary of this because obviously that can lead to state capture and to situations that can influence independent reporting. So that's something that it should be done very, very carefully. There are ways to do it, but you should be very careful on how to plan these kind of schemes. And finally, I think one of the questions that we haven't touched on before, and is definitely part of the answer, is collaboration. I mean, collaboration between different news organizations in different countries. We've seen this through Panama Papers and these kind of projects, but also on things like revenue and sharing tips on the things that worked or didn't work. I think that would be really, really valuable, and hopefully, this new fund that Khadija and others are starting will be helpful, will be able to help with this too.
Super, yeah, lots of really great examples there, and amazingly, in 20 minutes, I think we've come up with some decent solutions, if I may say. So we've got 3 minutes. Final, maybe quick fire to each of you. What is your sort of biggest source of hope for this industry, for this sector? Khadija?
I think that it's the spirit of many, many journalists who continue to do excellent work despite very difficult conditions. And that's as true in South Africa as it is in Hungary, as it is in Colombia, as it is in Brazil, as it is in India. It is often not easy to be a journalist. And yet we many of us wake up every day and give it our best. And that gives me hope. It tells me that there is something still worth fighting for.
Kemba?
I think for me, we're living in an age of crises, really, crises after crises. And I think my hope is that the more policymakers throughout all parts of government, not just in the section I deal with, which is the media freedom section, but everywhere, the more we can make those linkages about how journalists and media freedom sort of industry is supporting and part of the solution, not necessarily a problem, the more that's going to make me hopeful that governments can collectively take action. So I think those linkages as part of the solution, that's something I'm clinging on to.
Great. And Eduardo?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna go with Khadija here. I think what I see from our colleagues in places like Mexico, in places like Venezuela, places like El Salvador, India, of course, many other places where being a journalist can cost your life, is really, really inspiring. And also in our richer countries, in places like Spain or the UK or the US, I'm really inspired by seeing a journalist that is much, much more inclusive than it was before. Newsrooms used to be a place where, all white dudes in charge, and I don't see that anymore in many places. I think the industry is changing for the better, and hopefully in 10 years' time or so, even more. So, yeah.
That's it. That's a great way to finish. Thank you so much to our panelists. A really thoughtful conversation, I hope, with some really interesting takeaways, lessons, and, of course, hope. So big thanks to them. Big thanks to the organisers. And finally, just a big thanks to the organisers and a big thanks to my colleagues at TRF. Thanks.
Just as a war zone. Never want to go